Trigger warning: this program deals with slavery, coercion, and gendered violence. It addresses administrative and intimate abuses in restrained language. If these subjects are distressing, please take care as you watch. They opened the ledger on a sun-warmed table. Dust rose in soft motes, the spine protested, and the paper smelled of ink and time. A hand traced a line across a page where scribbles had been pressed so firmly, the impression lived beneath the surface. That line, an apparently ordinary stroke of a pen, would travel across generations. It would redraw who counted as family, who could sleep in certain beds, who could be counted in household rations. It would mark some women as chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with consent, and among those marked, some were turned into private property by public paperwork. What the nobles did in secret left scars that did not vanish with the closing of the book. This is the story we can reconstruct from the ledger, from a cuff with a stitched name, from a folded note found in an attic seam. It is the story of Amina, born into an account of debt and duty, of the household officials who administered lives as if they were inventory, and of the small stubborn acts that survived their attempts to erase. It is a history told by paper and thread, by margin notes and water stains, and by the people who have kept those fragments alive. Amina grew up along the riverbanks that skirted the estate. She learned to read in secret, copying letters on scraps while other children played. Hunger taught her to be small in plain sight. Curiosity taught her to keep a hidden notebook where she practiced names and numbers. Daniel, a field hand who learned to carve names on fence posts, appears in broken fragments of correspondence, brief lines that survive only because they were folded and hidden. Around them, a household apparatus kept watch: the steward who counted rations, the overseer who assigned beds, the scribe who turned decisions into inked marks, and a minister whose ritual language could be folded into the ledger's authority. The ledger itself acted as a moral register: columns for rations and clothing, margins for notes, and a steady hand that could make private intimacies enforceable by bureaucracy. After one quiet morning of cleaning, a young maid found a folded note tucked into the seam of an old chair cushion. It was brittle and stained, the ink faded but legible in places. Someone had placed it there deliberately. The note contained a short, intimate line, a memory of a shared night, a promise, the kind of thing people do when they hope to be remembered. That private fragment did not stay private. Within days, household authority convened a tribunal of its own making. An overseer, the steward, the minister, and the scribe gathered not to hear the truth, but to translate that truth into administrative consequence. The ledger records a term that appears repeatedly in these files: corrective assignment. In plain terms, this entry meant that a woman's status within the household was to be altered in response to perceived infractions of behavior or propriety. The phrase is administrative, almost antiseptic. That is the point. Bureaucracy makes violence legible in language meant to sound neutral. The ledger shows the scribe's hand darkening as a name was crossed in one column and written in another, as bed allocations were adjusted and a line item for visitation was struck through. These are the mechanics of control. The stroke of a pen became a boundary, and the boundary determined who had access to food, shelter, and human contact. When archives are opened, conservators and historians sift through material scars. Pages cut, water-damaged leaves, margins trimmed. These are not accidents. They are the traces of intent and omission. In the ledger, you can see where edges have been sliced away, where a later hand has attempted to obscure a marginal note. Other documents have suffered similar injuries: folds that conceal a sentence, pages pasted over, letters tucked into seams. These are the places where the archive itself bears witness to erasure. We must be clear about what the record allows and what it does not. At several points, the evidence is damaged or ambiguous. A line blinked out by water or by a precise cut. A scribe's script that might be a name or might be an account number. In those places we mark uncertainty, archival note, indefinido, or offer short reconstructions, identified explicitly as such. Where the ledger is clear, it is relentless. It logs not only labor and rations, but intimate arrangements, which women were given access to particular rooms, who could receive visits, who was counted in family support columns, and who was not. The mechanisms of control were not merely paperwork. Ritual and scripture were folded into the ledger's authority, turning spiritual language into administrative binding. Contemporary depositions and margin notes describe ceremonies, sometimes as brief as a bath and a coin placed in a palm, sometimes as formal as a minister reading aloud while the scribe wrote. The ritual might include a small book open to a passage whose meaning could be read as moral sanction. The minister's words grounded the action in spiritual language. The scribe's hand made it durable. A coin, placed in a palm and then recorded, acted as both symbol and entry fee, an offering transmuted into a contractual notation. These ceremonies presented themselves as corrective, sometimes as purification, but within the ledger they translated into permanent reclassification. One reconstructed passage, drawn from a damaged deposition and an adjoining ledger margin, reads as follows: reconstructed. The minister held the book. The coin rested in a closed hand. The scribe marked the ledger and spoke the woman's name in line. This is a reconstruction. It stitches together intact fragments to show how ritual and paperwork converged. The exact wording and sequence may be indefinito, where the paper is torn, but the convergence itself, the ritualized act becoming an administrative one, appears repeatedly in the surviving material. Once a corrective assignment was entered, its consequences were immediate and quotidian. Food rations shifted in the scribe's columns. Beds that had been shared became reassigned by notation. A woman's movement could be marked, permitted to fetch water only under supervision, allowed to cook only at certain hours, forbidden from speaking to particular men. Letters were censored or seized. Pages in a hidden notebook might be removed and deposited among the steward's files. The ledger records a reclassification of children as well, entries that moved infants and toddlers from one household column to another, changing how their support and identity would be recognized by the estate's record keepers. These are not abstract effects. They shape the smallest acts of everyday life. One entry shows that rations for household X, female, A, were reduced to a quarter of a standard share for a stated period, an administrative punishment with physical consequences. Another margin note indicates, in a shaky hand, that a bed previously listed as common room was now reserved. The scribe stroked marginalized bodies by redefining their access to warmth and rest. At the heart of this ledger-centered violence was a spatial reordering of intimacy. Private relationships were converted into public obligations. A woman marked in the ledger as chosen in the household's terms found her visits recorded as privileges that could be withdrawn and returned like books from a library. This conversion happened quietly, in that blend of ritual, moral language, and record-keeping that lent the household's decisions a veneer of legitimacy. And yet, the women did not disappear into the margins without contest. Resistance took many forms, small and courageous. A stitched cuff preserved in a conservation folder bears a name sewn into its hem, tiny, deliberate letters that refuse the erasure intended by ledger strokes. Some letters were concealed in hems and pillows. Other notes were folded into the bindings of hymnals. There are clear signs that teaching continued clandestinely. A smuggled exercise in letters folded into the lining of a dress. A grammar copied into the margins of a ledger page and then rubbed away by a later hand. These acts are not merely sentimental. They were survival strategies, ways of preserving identity when the record tried to remove it. The stitched cuff is a central witness. The textile shows we're consistent with daily use, and along the inner seam is a name, thread pulled through rough fabric in a careful hand. Conservation reports note that the stitch predates a later mending attempt. Someone tried to repair the cuff but left the seam with the sewn name visible only to those who knew to look. In a letter found sewn inside a lining, a note that references the name on the cuff, there are brief lines about learning to read by moonlight and about the small hope of holding one's child's hand without fear. That letter was folded and hidden for decades. The survival of that name in thread is testimony. Even when the ledger crossed out a line, someone sewed the person back into existence. We must attend to the domestic administrators who translated private acts into administrative order. The steward counted and balanced, the overseer enforced, the scribe made it permanent, and the minister supplied moral cover. Each role mattered. The steward's logbooks measure goods and people. The overseer's notes mark who could come and when. The scribe's hand made decisions not just legible, but enforceable. These men, roles rather than blanket social categories, are repeatedly implicated in the institutionalization of intimacy. The ledger shows that decisions were not spontaneous but organized, repeated, and formalized. The archive itself is uneven. Some pages are intact, some are torn or water-stained, other documents are missing entirely. These gaps are meaningful. At several crucial points, a crucial page has been trimmed away, its edge clean as if sliced, and the margin where a name might appear has been clipped. Some letters were deliberately pasted over. We do not know who ordered these alterations in every case, Archival note, indefinido, but the pattern suggests an intent to conceal. When a later investigator, whose notes survive in a separate file, attempted to piece together the missing passages, they wrote in the margin, "Pages removed or cut. Context indefinido." That admission of uncertainty is itself evidence. The archive resists tidy narrative. It demands humility. Those uncertainties shape the genealogical consequences. Families have been reconstituted on paper in ways that shaped inheritance and identity. When a child's name was entered into a household account in the column for dependents, that record affected who was counted for support and who might later be considered kin. Moves from one column to another could mean being listed as household property rather than family. Later descendants, when searching for ancestors, commonly find missing names or entries shifted by a single stroke of ink. A trimmed page might remove a parent's name entirely. These administrative decisions made lineage fragile. Their effects continued for generations. Resistance, however, persisted across those generations. Hidden letters offer vivid, brittle traces. One such note, found in a seam and preserved under glass, reads in part, archival transcription, fragmentary. "Learned my letters by your hand. Hold my child. Remember." The gaps between the fragments force us to reconstruct, not by filling them with invented detail, but by attending to what remains. The structure of care, the insistence on being named, the slow pedagogy of survival. Where the ledger tried to make what was intimate into a matter circumscribed by columns, people reasserted kinship through practice, lifting a child, sharing bread, teaching a neighbor to read. Investigator Lewis, who later cataloged parts of this collection, wrote notes that guide us. His observations are careful and measured. He describes water damage that has blurred ink beyond recognition on one leaf, and a margin where the ink appears to have been rubbed out deliberately on another. Professor Andrews provides contextual reading, interpreting the ritual language in depositions as part of a wider pattern in household governance, small ceremonies that legitimated administrative decisions. Amelia, an archivist who conserved the cuff, records the textile's fibers, the sequence of stitches, and the residue of something that looks like grease, likely the hands of someone who mended clothing while their nights were spent teaching another person to write. These professional voices in the record add interpretive layers without claiming certainties where the paper cannot bear them. We are compelled to consider the ritual moment where coin, scripture, and a scribe's stroke cohere into a decision that lasts. In the reconstructed scene, again, identified as reconstruction from ledger entries and depositions, a woman is led into a small room. A minister opens a book. A coin glints in a palm. The scribe's pen hovers. The minister speaks in a low voice about duty and order, invoking spiritual authority. The overseer stands with folded arms. The steward watches the scribe mark the ledger. The pen moves, a name is transferred from one column to another, and with the scribe's deliberate stroke, an intimate act becomes part of the household's administrative reality. This reconstructed moment is intentionally spare and clinical. We do not narrate details of coercion beyond what the documents imply. We emphasize instead the transformation. A ritual that might appear private in form becomes public in consequence because it is inscribed. The household converts the spiritual into the bureaucratic. This is how small ceremonies are made durable. The ledger translates rituals into categories: privilege, restriction, assignment, so that the social order can be enforced not only by watchfulness, but by ink. The immediate aftermath was daily enforcement. Sleep, food, and movement watched and adjusted according to ledger entries. The women who were chosen in the household's terms found their lives carefully circumscribed. When letters were intercepted, they left gaps in the historical record. When visits were forbidden, emotional networks tightened in hidden corners. Yet acts of agency continued. A midwife who appears in a marginal note slipped an extra measure of flour into a pocket. A teacher risked reprimand to show a girl's hand how to write a letter. A man named Daniel, present in fragmented correspondence as a lover and a field hand, left a carved name on a fence post, a stubborn public trace that outlived the ledger's alterations. The ledger's paper and the cuff's fabric eventually arrived at a conservation lab. There, humidity and light were recorded. Threads were measured in millimeters. Ink was tested with non-invasive techniques to understand the layering of entries. Conservators found evidence that some ledger pages had been intentionally washed, water stains consistent with deliberate application rather than accidental dampness. In another case, corners had been carefully cut off, as if excising a name. The cuff's conservator documented that the sewn name had been covered at some point by a different patch. Someone had tried to hide the stitching, perhaps to protect it, or perhaps to hide it from prying eyes. These material traces complicate simple narratives of victimhood and perpetration. They show layered attempts to both erase and preserve. When descendants and researchers attempt to understand the human cost of these administrative decisions, they must reckon with what the records refuse to disclose. There are entries that imply punitive actions but lack explicit narration. There are ledger lines that correspond to reduced rations but do not explain why. Some of the most telling evidence is absence. Where a child's name should be, there is a scissors smooth edge. These gaps are a kind of violence. The archive itself has been weaponized to render people invisible. At the same time, the archive also hosts traces of resistance. The act of sewing a name into a cuff, of hiding a letter, of carving a name into wood. These are counter-archives. They resist official erasure by making memory tactile and portable. Historians who engage with these collections must practice humility. When confronting a ledger that records a corrective assignment, they must say what the paper shows and what it does not. Where the record is torn, say so. Where the scribe's intention is unclear, mark it indefinido. When reconstructing a ritual, label the scene as reconstruction and avoid filling in sensual details the documents do not provide. This is not mere caution, it is ethics. The women at the center of these files deserve narratives that foreground their agency and endurance, not speculation that turns them into objects of curiosity. There are also ethical responsibilities for public historians and documentary makers. These artifacts, pages, letters, a cuff, are fragile witnesses. They require care in handling, conservation funding, and thoughtful interpretation. They also require that we listen to living descendants and communities who may have reasons to ask for privacy or restitution. Preserving archives is not about satisfying academic curiosity alone. It is about safeguarding evidence for truth and memory, about enabling communities to reclaim erased stories. The final image of this story is deceptively simple. The cuff in a conservation room, its threads refracted under white light, the ledger closed, but its margins still speaking. The conservation report catalogs the cuff, noting the sewn name and the sequence of mends. The ledger, wrapped in acid-free paper, bears small notes tucked into its leaves. C. Margin notes, pages trimmed, context indefinido. The artifacts remain, simultaneously damaged and eloquent. What the nobles did in secret did indeed leave scars, not only the personal injuries that paper cannot fully convey, but the administrative remaking of lives that shaped identities across generations. Yet the ledger is not the only actor in this story. Stitched names, hidden letters, carved posts, and the quiet work of teaching and sharing bread are testimony to survival. They remind us that human dignity persisted, even where bureaucracy tried to obliterate it. If this account matters to you, please subscribe and consider supporting archival preservation. These materials require funding and care to tell their stories. We close with a restrained appeal to memory and repair. Share this story with someone who needs to know the complex ways institutions wielded paperwork as a form of power. Leave reflections in the comments about the small acts of resistance that surprised you. If you can, consider donating or volunteering with local archival preservation efforts. Conserving pages and preserving voices is a public duty. Above all, remember that paper keeps more than numbers. It keeps traces of lives that demand to be seen. The cuff rests now beneath careful light. The ledger is closed, but its margins are not silent. Between the ink and the thread, between the trimmed edges and the hidden seams, the archive speaks, sometimes in full sentences, sometimes in the faintest of scratches, and it asks us to read responsibly, to preserve diligently, and to make space for the people who labored to keep their names alive.